The girl cried in silence, holding a piece of hard bread while the house filled with the smell of a feast. In the next room, the half-brother laughed, and the stepmother smiled as if everything was in perfect harmony. But everything changes when the father, a millionaire, arrives early and witnesses the devastating scene. At that moment, he discovers the truth and makes the most important decision of his life. Before listening to this incredible story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more exciting tales. Victor adjusted his tie in front of the bathroom mirror, observing the grey hairs that were beginning to appear at his temples. At 42, he felt the weight of loneliness like never before. The house, once filled with laughter and lively conversation, now echoed only silence, broken only by the light footsteps of Helena, his 8-year-old daughter. It had been 3 years since Agnes, his wife, had left, leaving a void that seemed impossible to fill. Each room held memories. The kitchen where she prepared breakfast while humming, the living room where they watched movies on Sundays, the garden where she grew roses. Victor tried to keep everything as it was, as if preserving the setting could somehow keep her presence alive. Helena was a sweet girl, with curly brown hair and large eyes. That seemed to hold a sadness too old for her age. She rarely smiled since her mother passed away, and Victor noticed how the absence of a maternal figure weighed on the child's fragile shoulders. The girl woke up early, made her own bed, and went downstairs to have breakfast alone while her father prepared for another day at the law office. At night, she curled up on the sofa with a book of fairy tales, leafing through the pages without really reading, just waiting for her father to come home from work so they could have dinner together in a silence they had both learned to share. Work consumed Victor. It was his way of escaping the pain, of not thinking about the empty chair at the table, the half-cold bed, the plans they had made together that now lay buried along with Agnes. He dedicated himself to complex cases, stayed late at the office, accepted every client who came along. His partners commented that he was overworking himself, but Victor simply nodded and continued working. It was easier than going home and facing the emptiness. It was on a rainy June afternoon that everything began to change. Victor had been invited to give a lecture on family law in the capital, and he almost refused the invitation. He wasn't in the mood for social events, but his partner insisted it would be good for him to get out of the office for a while. Reluctantly, Victor accepted. The lecture was in an elegant hotel in the city center, with dark wood paneling and crystal chandeliers that reflected a golden light on the attendees. During the break, while sipping weak coffee and watching the lawyers chatting in small groups, Victor noticed a woman beside the drinks table. She was elegant, wearing an impeccable navy blue suit, and had blonde hair styled in a sophisticated bun. There was something about her posture that drew attention, a natural confidence that contrasted with the vulnerability Victor perceived in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. Chiara Mueller. That was her name, as Victor discovered when she introduced herself with a polite smile. She was an architect, had recently moved to the capital from the countryside, and was there accompanying a lawyer friend. The conversation flowed naturally between them, beginning with comments about the lecture and extending to more personal matters. Victor discovered that Chiara was also a widow, that she had lost her husband 2 years earlier in an accident, and that she had a 9-year-old son named Luca. The pain of loss was something they both shared, and this created an immediate connection. In the following months, Victor and Chiara began to meet more frequently. Discreet dinners in quiet restaurants, walks in the park on Sundays, long conversations about their lives, their fears, their hopes. Chiara spoke about the difficulty of raising a child alone, of balancing career with motherhood, of trying to keep the memory of her father alive for Luca while moving forward. Victor shared his own struggles, the guilt he felt for not being able to fill the void that Agnes had left in Helena's life, the fear that his daughter would grow up without the maternal love that every child deserves. Chiara was attentive and understanding. She listened patiently to Victor, offered words of comfort, and suggested practical solutions to the challenges he faced with Helena. When she finally met the girl, in a carefully planned encounter at an ice cream parlor, Chiara was affectionate and interested. She asked about school, about the drawings Helena liked to make, about her favorite ice cream flavors. Helena shyly answered the questions, and Victor felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. Perhaps, just perhaps, he could build a new family, give Helena the maternal figure she so desperately needed. Luca was a vibrant boy with dark hair and inexhaustible energy. He loved soccer, video games, and outdoor adventures. At their first meeting in a playground, Luca tried to include Helena in his games, but she remained reserved, watching from afar as he ran and jumped around the playground equipment. Victor and Chiara exchanged hopeful glances, imagining that with time the children would grow closer, that they would become true siblings. The meetings became more frequent, and Victor began to feel alive again. Chiara had a way of lighting up any room she entered. Her laughter was contagious, and her stories about architectural projects were fascinating. She knew hidden restaurants in the capital, knew where to find the best wines, and had an endless list of films and books to recommend. Victor found himself rediscovering simple pleasures he had forgotten since Agnes left. Strolls without a specific destination, conversations that stretched into the early hours of the morning, plans for the future that no longer seemed impossible. Helena observed everything with her large, silent eyes. She said nothing against Chiara, but neither did she show the enthusiasm Victor expected. When her father asked if she had liked Aunt Chiara, Helena merely shrugged and murmured a soft yes before returning to her room. Victor attributed his daughter's reserve to the still recent grief, to the natural difficulty of accepting a new person occupying the space that had previously belonged exclusively to her mother. He believed that with time, Helena would open up, that she would learn to love Chiara as a second mother. It was on a September night, during a romantic dinner at an Italian restaurant overlooking the illuminated city, that Victor made the decision. He held Chiara's hand on the table, felt his heart race, and asked the question he had rehearsed dozens of times in his mind. Chiara remained silent for a moment that seemed like an eternity, her eyes welling up with tears, before accepting with an emotional yes. They toasted with champagne, made plans, imagined what it would be like to unite their families in a new home where they could start over, without the shadows of the past. Victor could hardly wait to tell Helena. He imagined the scene, his daughter's joy at knowing they would no longer be alone, that they would have a complete family again. But when he arrived home that night and found Helena on the sofa, drawing in her notebook, the words came out with more hesitation than he had expected. The girl looked up when her father sat beside her, and Victor explained that Chiara would be a permanent part of their lives, that they would live together, that she would gain a brother and a new mother to take care of her. Helena said nothing. She simply observed her father with those deep eyes that seemed to see through his words, to perceive something Victor didn't yet understand. Then, in a low voice, she asked if this meant they would forget their mother. Victor quickly denied it, explaining that no one would ever replace Agnes, that their mother would always have a special place in their hearts, but that it was important to move on, to create new memories, to build a new life. Helena nodded slowly but didn't smile, and Victor felt a tightness in his chest that he tried to ignore. The wedding preparations were quick and practical. Neither Victor nor Chiara wanted a large ceremony, just an intimate celebration with close family and a few friends. The new house was carefully chosen, a spacious two-story house in a quiet neighborhood, with 4 bedrooms, a large garden, and a modern kitchen that Chiara immediately loved. She was involved in every detail of the decoration, choosing curtains, rugs, furniture, transforming the house into a welcoming and sophisticated home. Helena watched the changes in silence. She observed as her belongings were packed, as the house, where she had lived with her mother, was emptied, as her memories were placed in boxes and transported to an unknown place. Victor tried to cheer her up, showing her the room that would be hers, painted lilac, as she had once mentioned liking, with a new bookcase for her books and a desk near the window. Chiara had even placed fresh flowers on the dresser, a delicate touch that should have made Helena smile. But the girl only thanked him politely and began to unpack her things with silent meticulousness. Luca, on the other hand, was excited about the new family setup. He ran through the rooms of the house, explored the garden, and had already chosen where he would set up his swing and where to play ball. He tried again to involve Helena in his games, but the girl remained distant, preferring to stay in her room organizing her things or reading in the corner of the sofa. The wedding ceremony took place on a sunny October morning. Victor wore a light grey suit, Chiara an elegant and simple white dress. Helena looked beautiful in a light pink dress, her hair styled in a delicate bun, but her face remained serious as she watched the adults exchange vows and rings. Luca, beside her, smiled broadly, clearly happy with the new family being formed. After the ceremony, there was a luncheon in the garden of their new home, with tables decorated with white flowers and soft music playing in the background. The guests chatted animatedly, complimenting the couple and wishing them happiness. Chiara circulated gracefully among the tables, thanking everyone for their congratulations and introducing Victor to her friends. Victor felt complete again. He looked at his new wife, at his 2 children playing in the garden, and believed he had finally found his way back to happiness. That night, when the guests had left and the house was quiet, Victor went upstairs to check on the children before bed. Luca was already fast asleep, hugging a teddy bear. Helena was awake, sitting on the bed, looking out the window at the dark garden outside. Victor sat beside her, ran his hand through his daughter's hair, and asked if everything was all right. Helena turned to him, and for the first time in a long time, Victor saw tears silently streaming down the girl's face. She didn't say anything, just hugged her father tightly, and Victor felt his heart clench. He promised himself that he would make everything right, that he would give Helena the family she deserved, that this would be a new chance at happiness for all of them. If only he knew what was coming. The first few days in the new house were filled with discoveries and adjustments. Victor woke up early, getting ready for work, while Chiara prepared breakfast in the spacious and well-lit kitchen. Sunlight streamed in through the large windows, reflecting off the white tiles and the marble countertop that Chiara had chosen with such care. It was a magazine-worthy kitchen, with modern appliances and a set of copper pots hanging artistically above the stove. Helena descended the stairs slowly, always the last to arrive at the table. Luca was already seated, animated, chatting about the game he had watched on television the previous night, or about the friends he would make at his new school. Chiara served her son attentively, placing warm pancakes on his plate, pouring fresh orange juice into his glass, and gently stroking his hair as he ate. Victor watched the scene with satisfaction, feeling that he had made the right decision. Here was the image of the perfect family he so longed to rebuild. When Helena sat down, Chiara would quickly look up, offer a brief smile, and continue her activities in the kitchen. There was always something urgent to do. Check if the oven was off, organize the dishes, prepare the lunchboxes for school. Helena waited silently, staring at the empty plate in front of her, until Chiara, almost as an afterthought, placed simple toast and a glass of juice on the plate. There were no warm pancakes that Luca received, nor the affectionate touch on. Her hair, only the basics served with mechanical efficiency. Victor rarely noticed these subtleties. He was busy reading the newspaper, checking emails on his cell phone, mentally already organizing the day's meetings. When he looked up, he saw Chiara taking care of Luca, saw Helena eating her toast, and everything seemed to be in order. He kissed his daughter's forehead before leaving, wished everyone a good day, and left for the office with the peace of mind that he had left his family in good hands. The school was a renowned institution in the capital, with navy blue uniforms and a reputation for academic excellence. Helena and Luca would be studying at the same school, although in different grades. On the first day, Chiara personally accompanied them, walking between the two in the wide hallway decorated with student work. Luca held his mother's hand confidently, waving to other boys who seemed friendly. Helena walked on the other side, her empty hands swinging at her sides, her eyes fixed on the gleaming linoleum floor. When they arrived at the courtyard, Chiara bent down to adjust Luca's tie, kissed his forehead, and offered encouraging words about making new friends and having fun. Luca smiled, waved, and ran off to join a group of boys near the basketball court. Then Chiara turned to Helena, who was waiting patiently, and with a quick wave of her hand, indicated the direction of the girls' classroom. There was no uniform adjustment, no kiss, no words of encouragement, just a hurried gesture and a glance that didn't linger. Helena felt the familiar lump tighten in her throat, but she swallowed back tears. She walked alone to her classroom, found an empty desk at the back and sat down silently. The other children chatted animatedly, sharing stories about their holidays, showing off new toys, forming natural friendship groups. Helena opened her backpack, took out a notebook, and began to draw, creating her own world where she didn't feel so invisible. At home, the routine gradually established itself with a predictability that Helena learned to read like a map of exclusion. After school, Chiara always had a special snack prepared for Luca: homemade cookies, fresh fruit cut into fun shapes, freshly squeezed natural juices. She would sit with him at the table, ask about his day, laugh at his stories, and help with his homework when needed. It was a moment of connection, of mindful attention, of maternal love in its purest form. Helena would arrive home to find the kitchen empty, or Chiara busy with some household chore. There were rarely any questions about how her day had been. Sometimes Chiara would leave a few plain biscuits on a plate on the counter, without any ceremony or comment. Helena would take 2 or 3, carry them to her room, and do her homework alone, the muffled sound of Luca's laughter, and Chiara climbing upstairs a constant reminder that she was outside looking in. But Helena was observant and tried to understand the unspoken rules of that new house. She began to help more, hoping that perhaps through her helpfulness she could earn a place, a kind word, a genuine smile. After finishing her lessons, she would go downstairs and begin tidying the living room, folding the blankets from the sofa, arranging the cushions, picking up the toys Luca left scattered around. She did everything quietly, carefully, hoping that Chiara would notice and thank her. Chiara noticed. Her eyes followed Helena's movements around the room, but there was no gratitude, only a silent watch, as if she was supervising an employee. When Helena finished and looked at her stepmother expecting recognition, Chiara simply turned and continued what she was doing, sometimes murmuring a comment about something that hadn't been arranged perfectly. Mealtimes had become the most painful part of the day. Dinner was served at a large varnished wooden table, seating 6. Victor sat at the head of the table, Chiara to his right, Luca beside her. Helena sat on the other side of the table, further away, her chair slightly separated from the rest of the family. Chiara prepared elaborate dishes, succulent roasts, homemade pasta, fresh salads, desserts. That made Luca's eyes sparkle with anticipation. Luca and Victor received generous portions, the best pieces, the most succulent slices. Chiara served herself sparingly, and then, almost as an afterthought, placed what was left on Helena's plate. A smaller piece, sometimes drier, with simple accompaniments. Helena looked at her plate and then at the plates of the others, seeing the clear discrepancy, feeling the injustice burning in her chest. But she didn't complain. She had learned that complaining led nowhere, only made the silence even heavier. Victor ate distractedly, talking about cases from the office, asking Chiara questions about her architecture projects. He asked Luca about school, listened excitedly to the goal the boy had scored at recess. Sometimes he turned to Helena and asked about her day, but the answer was always brief. Everything was fine. Victor accepted the answer without investigating further, his plate and his attention returning to Chiara and Luca. There were also the little rules that Chiara established without words. One of them, Helena quickly realized, was that certain areas of the house were Luca's territory. The most comfortable sofa in the living room was where he watched television. The best armchair in the library was where he played video games. The garden swing, although theoretically belonging to both of them, was always occupied by Luca when Helena approached, and Chiara always found a reason for him to continue playing there longer. Helena learned to occupy empty spaces, forgotten corners. She read on the stair steps, drew on the bedroom floor, played alone at the back of the garden where the old neglected rose bushes formed a silent refuge. It was there, among the withered flowers and thorns, that she felt safest, most like herself. One Saturday afternoon, as the rain drummed against the windows and the sky was leaden grey, Chiara decided to prepare something special. The smell of chocolate and cinnamon filled the house, causing Helena to get out of bed where she was reading and come downstairs, drawn by the comforting fragrance. In the kitchen, Chiara was baking brownies, and Luca was helping by cracking eggs and stirring the batter, his fingers covered in chocolate and his face lit up with joy. Helena stopped in the kitchen doorway, observing the scene. Part of her wanted to ask if she could help too, to participate in that warm family moment. But before she could gather the courage to speak, Chiara looked at her and, in a neutral tone, said that everything was under control, that Helena could go back to her room if she wanted. It wasn't rude, it wasn't hostile, but it was definitive. Helena nodded and slowly climbed the stairs, each step weighing like a rejection. Later, when the brownies were ready, Luca received 2 generous squares, still warm, with melting vanilla ice cream beside them. Victor also got his share, praising Chiara's culinary talent. Helena received a small cold piece on a simple plate, delivered without comment. She ate, it silently in her room, the taste of the chocolate mixed with the bitterness of exclusion. Night was falling on the house, and Helena was getting ready for bed when she heard laughter coming from the living room. She quietly left her room and peeked up the stairs. Victor, Chiara, and Luca were watching a movie together, sharing popcorn, wrapped in blankets, a perfect picture of a happy family. Helena watched for a moment, invisible in the shadows, feeling like a stranger in her own home. Then she went back to her room, closed the door carefully, and lay down on the bed, hugging her pillow. Underneath the mattress, hidden where no one could find it, Helena kept a photograph of her mother. It was a small photo, taken on a summer day in the park, with Agnes smiling radiantly, her arms enveloping Helena in a tight embrace. The girl would take this photo every night before bed, trace her mother's face with her finger, and whisper her worries, her fears, her loneliness. It was her secret ritual, her way of keeping the memory alive, even when she felt the world around her wanted to erase it. Victor remained oblivious to all of this. He saw a united family. He saw his daughter quiet but seemingly well-adjusted. He saw Chiara diligently caring for the house. When Helena was particularly quiet, he attributed it to the girl's reserved temperament, perhaps still processing her grief. When Chiara treated Luca with explicit affection and Helena with polite neutrality, Victor interpreted it as a mother's natural favoritism towards her biological son, something that would balance out over time. But Helena knew the truth. She felt it in the emptiness of her stomach when she went to sleep, in the tears she silently shed on her pillow, in the weight she carried in her chest every day. She was alone in that house full of people, invisible despite being there. And the worst part was knowing that her father, the only person who should have protected her, didn't see her suffering. He was too busy building his new, happy life to realize that he had left his daughter behind in the process. Weeks turned into months, and autumn gave way to winter. The capital awoke shrouded in a cold fog that seeped through coats and sweaters, making the mornings even grayer. Helena had been wearing the same coat for 2 winters, the sleeves becoming too short for her growing arms, but no one seemed to notice. Luca, on the other hand, was debuting a new designer coat, padded and modern, which Chiara had bought at an expensive downtown store. Victor remained immersed in his work. A particularly complex case had consumed all his attention in recent weeks, involving a corporate dispute that required long hours of research and preparation. He would leave before breakfast and return when the children were ready for bed. On weekends, he would lock himself in his home office, surrounded by piles of documents, only emerging for quick meals before returning to the cases. Chiara used these absences to further solidify the household dynamic. She had established a meticulous routine that perfectly served her purposes. Luca had extra football lessons on Tuesdays and Thursdays, swimming on Wednesdays and English on Saturdays. Chiara personally took him to each activity, waited during the lessons, chatted with other parents, and fully integrated herself into her son's life. Helena had no extracurricular activities. When Victor suggested that perhaps she would enjoy ballet or learning piano, Chiara quickly argued about the additional costs and time it would require, suggesting that perhaps it would be better to wait until Helena expressed a clearer interest. At school, Helena remained the quiet girl who sat at the back of the class. Her teacher, Olivia, a woman in her 40s with red hair and colorful rimmed glasses, began to notice something strange in the students' behavior. Helena always completed her assignments, Her grades were good, but there was a sadness in her eyes that didn't match a child her age. She didn't play at recess. She preferred to sit under a tree with a book or her sketchbook. One day, Olivia approached Helena during recess and sat next to her. She asked about the drawing the girl was making, a garden full of colourful flowers with a small figure alone in the corner. Helena shyly explained that it was her favourite place at home, the corner with the rose bushes. Olivia asked if she wouldn't prefer to play with the other children, and Helena just shrugged, saying she liked being alone. But there was something in the way she said it, a premature resignation, that worried Olivia. The teacher began to pay closer attention. She noticed that Helena's lunchbox rarely had the same level of variety and care as the other children's. While some students brought elaborate sandwiches, fruit cut into fun shapes, and homemade cookies, Helena's lunchbox contained the basics: plain bread with cheese, an apple, maybe some ordinary crackers. Olivia also noticed that Helena's coat was old, that her shoes were worn out, and that sometimes she wore the same outfit several times in the same week. At a parents' meeting, Olivia finally met Chiara in person. The stepmother arrived punctually, elegantly dressed with a professional smile and a confident posture. She listened attentively as Olivia spoke about Helena's academic performance, asking pertinent questions and demonstrating appropriate interest. But when Olivia subtly mentioned her concern about Helena seeming socially isolated, Chiara quickly explained that the girl was naturally reserved, that she was going through an adjustment process after the loss of her biological mother, and that everything was fine at home. Olivia wanted to believe. Chiara was convincing, articulate, and presented the image of a caring and concerned stepmother. But something in the conversation unsettled the teacher, a dissonance between Chiara's words and the coldness in her eyes when she spoke about Helena. Olivia decided to continue observing, ready to intervene if necessary. At home, the situation continued to deteriorate in subtle ways. Chiara began implementing specific rules for Helena that didn't apply to Luca. The girl had to finish all the household chores assigned to her before having any free time. These chores included folding clothes, tidying the living room, sweeping the hallway, and organizing the books on the shelf. Luca, of course, had no such responsibilities. His duties were limited to keeping his own room reasonably tidy, something that wasn't always strictly enforced. Helena performed these tasks without complaint, hoping that perhaps her obedience would be rewarded with some affection or recognition. But the more she did, the more imperfections Chiara seemed to find. The cushions weren't perfectly aligned, the floor could be cleaner, the books weren't organized alphabetically. There was never a compliment, only veiled criticism or disapproving silences. One afternoon, Helena had finished sweeping the entire hallway and was organizing the bookshelf when Luca ran past, knocking over a stack of books she had carefully arranged. The books scattered across the floor with a thud. Chiara appeared in the living room doorway, looked at the mess, and without asking what had happened, coldly told Helena to clean up the mess immediately. Helena tried to explain that it had been Luca, but Chiara had already left, taking her son to the kitchen for a special snack of carrot cake she had just baked. Helena knelt down and began to gather the books, her hands trembling, hot tears silently streaming down her face. She quickly wiped them away with the back of her hand. She didn't want anyone to see her crying. After rearranging all the books again, she went upstairs to her room and retrieved her mother's photo from its hiding place. She held the image against her chest and let the tears flow freely, whispering to the photo that she missed her, that she needed her, that she didn't know how to go on anymore. The neighbors began to notice that something wasn't right in that house. Marco and Fiona, an elderly couple who lived next door, frequently heard strange sounds through the thin walls. Sometimes it was loud voices, Chiara's speaking in a harsh tone that contrasted with the public sweetness she displayed. Other times, it was the muffled sound of crying, so low it was difficult to be sure but persistent enough to cause concern. Fiona mentioned to Marco that she had seen Helena in the garden several times, always alone, always with that distant, heartbreaking expression. Marco, a man of strong principles but who respected other people's privacy, suggested that perhaps they should observe a little more before drawing conclusions. But Fiona couldn't get the image of the girl out of her head. There was something in Helena's posture, in the way her shoulders slumped as if she were carrying an invisible weight that reminded Fiona of her own difficult childhood. One Sunday morning, when Victor finally had a day off from work, he decided to prepare a special breakfast for his family. It was a tradition he maintained with Agnes, making pancakes and bacon on Sundays, and he wanted to relive that memory with his new family. He woke up early, put on an apron, and began working in the kitchen, whistling an old tune. Luca was the first to come down, drawn by the delicious smell. He hugged Victor, who affectionately stroked his hair, and served a generous stack of pancakes on the boy's plate. Chiara came down next, wearing an elegant robe, and kissed Victor on the cheek, praising his initiative. She helped herself to coffee and a moderate portion of food, sitting down elegantly at the table. Helena was the last to appear, descending the stairs slowly, her eyes still swollen from sleep. When she entered the kitchen, Victor smiled broadly and said he had prepared a special breakfast for everyone. He filled a plate with pancakes for Helena, added strawberries and chocolate syrup, just as she liked them when Agnes was still alive. Helena sat at the table, looked at the plate with surprise and gratitude, and for the first time in weeks, a small smile touched her lips. It was a perfect moment, or almost, because Helena noticed the look Chiara gave her plate, a quick glance, but full of something the girl couldn't quite name. Disapproval? Resentment? Whatever it was, it made Helena's smile disappear as quickly as it had appeared. During breakfast, Victor was excited, making plans for the day. How about they all go to the park, or maybe to the movies? Luca jumped up with excitement, suggesting the superhero movie that was playing. Chiara sweetly agreed, saying it would be wonderful to spend the day as a family. Victor looked at Helena, expecting her to show enthusiasm too, but the girl only nodded quietly, her gaze fixed on her plate. The trip to the movies was a mixed experience. Victor bought large popcorn to share, sodas and candy. During the film, Luca sat between Victor and Chiara, receiving attention from both, whispered comments and shared laughter. Helena sat on the other side of Victor, but there was a space between them, filled only by the darkness of the cinema and the sound of the film's epic soundtrack. After the movie, they went to a famous diner in the capital known for its giant hamburgers and creamy milkshakes. Luca ordered the biggest hamburger on the menu and a triple chocolate milkshake. Victor ordered the same, saying it was a day of celebration. Chiara chose a Caesar salad, always mindful of her figure. When it was Helena's turn, she looked at the menu with hungry eyes, seeing the delicious options. But before she could speak, Chiara suggested that perhaps she wanted something lighter, since she had eaten so much for breakfast. Victor, distracted looking at his cell phone, simply agreed, and Helena ended up ordering a small sandwich and a juice. She ate her sandwich in silence, watching Luca devour his enormous hamburger, watching Victor and Chiara talk about the new renovations they planned to do in the living room, watching everyone go about their lives while she remained on the periphery, present, but not included. On the way home, Luca fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted from so much excitement. Victor was driving, Chiara beside him in the passenger seat, and Helena sat alone in the back with her sleeping half-brother. She looked out the window, watching the city pass by in a blur of lights and shadows, and wondered if anyone would ever really see her, if anyone would notice that she was slowly disappearing inside that house full of people. When they arrived home, Victor carried Luca to his room, carefully placed the boy on his bed, and kissed his forehead. Helena went upstairs alone, changed her clothes, brushed her teeth, and lay down on her bed. She waited to hear her father's footsteps coming up the stairs, as he usually did, to say good night, but the footsteps never came. Victor was tired. He had gone straight up to his room with Chiara, and in the rush of the day he had forgotten to check on Helena. The girl lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of the house quieting down for the night. She retrieved her mother's photo from under the mattress, held it to her chest, and whispered a silent prayer, asking for strength to go on. Because somehow she knew things would get worse before they got better, if they ever did. Winter deepened, bringing temperatures that made people huddle inside their coats and run from one warm place to another. The family home maintained artificial warmth, but for Helena no amount of heating seemed capable of melting the cold she felt inside. Luca began to notice more things. He wasn't a bad child, just spoiled by circumstances and his mother's excessive love. But as he grew and his conscience developed, small details began to bother him. He noticed that Helena always received less food at mealtimes. He noticed that she never had new clothes while his wardrobe was always being renewed. He noticed that his mother rarely smiled at Helena, never called her by the affectionate nicknames she used with him. One night after dinner, Luca was in his room playing video games when he heard a strange sound coming from Helena's room. It was a muffled, restrained cry, the kind of cry someone makes trying very hard not to be heard. He paused the game, opened the bedroom door, and walked silently down the hallway. Helena's door was ajar, and through the crack he could see his sister sitting on the bed, hugging her knees, crying silently while looking at a picture Luca couldn't identify. Something stirred within Luca's chest, a discomfort he couldn't name. He thought about going in, asking what was wrong, offering comfort, but his mother's voice calling him from the living room made him hesitate, and eventually he returned to his room, but the sound of that crying kept echoing in his mind. The next day at breakfast, Luca attentively observed the family dynamic. His mother prepared crepes filled with Nutella for him, served them with a radiant smile, and kissed his cheek as she placed the plate on the table. For Helena, there were only cold toast and a glass of milk. Luca looked at his sister's plate, then at his own, and felt for the first time a pang of guilt. When Chiara left the kitchen to answer the phone, Luca pushed his plate closer to Helena and whispered that she could have a crepe if she wanted. Helena looked at him in surprise, her eyes filling with tears of gratitude. She quickly grabbed half a crepe and ate it in small, hurried bites, as if she feared someone might take it away from her at any moment. Chiara returned before Helena finished, and her eyes immediately caught the scene. Luca's plate with less food, Helena chewing on something that clearly wasn't toast. The look she gave them both was one of pure warning, and Luca felt a chill run down his spine. He had never seen that expression on his mother's face before, and it frightened him. Later, when they were alone, Chiara pulled Luca aside and spoke in a low but firm tone. She explained that Helena had different dietary needs, that it was important to maintain a specific eating routine for her, and that Luca shouldn't interfere in these matters. When the boy tried to ask why Helena always seemed to have less, Chiara quickly changed the subject, asking if he didn't want to go to the mall to buy a new game. The distraction tactic worked momentarily, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Luca began to pay more attention, and the more he observed, the more uncomfortable he became. He saw how his mother ignored Helena when the girl tried to show her a drawing she had made. He saw how she sighed impatiently when Helena asked questions. He saw how there was always an excuse for Helena not to participate in the special activities he did with Chiara. At school, Luca had many friends. He was popular, athletic, always included in recess games and his classmates' birthday parties. During one of these recesses, he saw Helena sitting alone under her usual tree, drawing in her notebook. Something made him walk over there, leaving the soccer game behind. He sat down next to her without asking permission, and Helena looked up in surprise. Luca asked if he could see the drawing, and Helena shyly turned the notebook over. It was a drawing of a house, but not the house where they lived now. It was another house, smaller, more welcoming, with a garden full of flowers and two figures on the porch. A woman and a girl holding hands, both smiling. Luca asked who the people in the drawing were. Helena hesitated, then whispered that it was her and her mother, her real mother, in the old house. Luca was silent for a moment, processing this information. He knew that Helena had another mother before Chiara, that she had lost that mother, but he had never really thought about what that meant for his sister. Impulsively, Luca asked if she missed him. Helena nodded, her eyes filling with tears that she quickly blinked away. She said she missed him terribly every day, that sometimes she still dreamed about him and woke up, thinking it had all been a nightmare, only to discover that reality was the real nightmare. Helena's words hit Luca in a way he hadn't expected. He thought about what it would be like to lose his own mother, what it would be like to live in a house where he felt he didn't belong. The guilt he had begun to feel intensified, mixed with confusion about what to do. That afternoon, When Chiara picked them up from school, Luca remained silent the entire way home. He watched as his mother chatted animatedly with him, but didn't say a word to Helena. He saw how, at the traffic light, she reached back and carefully adjusted his seatbelt, but didn't even look to check if Helena's was secure. At home, Chiara prepared an elaborate snack of freshly baked cookies and chocolate milk for Luca. Helena entered the kitchen expecting the same, but Chiara simply pointed to a jar of plain cookies on the counter and continued focusing on Luca, asking about his swimming lesson, his friends, and his math test. Luca ate his cookies, but they tasted like ashes in his mouth. He glanced at Helena sitting in the other corner of the kitchen with her bland biscuits, and suddenly he could no longer pretend not to see what was happening. Gathering his courage, he asked aloud, "Mum, why didn't Helena get cookies too?" The silence that followed was heavy and tense. Chiara turned slowly to Luca, her face maintaining its composure but her eyes gleaming with something dangerous. She patiently explained that she had made enough cookies just for him, that they were special, because he had done well in swimming. Luca, not fully understanding but sensing the inadequacy of the answer, insisted, "But Helena got good grades too. Why, can't she?" Chiara approached Luca, placed her hand on his shoulder with a grip that was almost painful, and whispered low enough for only him to hear, "Do you want to be treated like her? Do you want to receive the same as she receives? Because I can arrange that." The fear that gripped Luca was instant and profound. It wasn't just the threat in the words, but the cold tone, the implication that being in Helena's place would be a punishment. He shook his head quickly, murmuring an apology. Chiara smiled, returning to her warm maternal demeanor as if nothing had happened, and offered Luca more chocolate milk. But Luca had learned something important in that moment. Questioning Helena's treatment meant risking his own comfort. It was a cruel lesson for a child to learn, and it created an internal division within him that would torment him. Part of him wanted to help Helena, wanted to stand up against the injustice he was witnessing, but another part, the selfish and frightened part, only wanted to keep the peace, keep his mother's love, keep his own safety. In the following days, Luca became quieter. He continued to observe, but stopped, confronting. When he saw Helena receive less, he lowered his eyes. When he heard his mother speak harshly to Helena, he pretended not to notice. But the guilt grew inside him like a weight that became heavier each day. One rainy afternoon, when Chiara had gone out shopping and the children were home alone, Luca finally mustered the courage to speak to Helena directly. He found her in her room, doing her homework at her desk. He knocked softly on the door, and she invited him in with surprise. Luca sat on the edge of Helena's bed and remained silent, for a moment, searching for the right words. Finally, he said, "I know my mother isn't nice to you. I can see it, and I'm sorry." Helena looked at him, her eyes large and sad, and Luca saw in them a mixture of gratitude and resignation. She said softly, "It's not your fault, Luca. You don't need to apologize for her." But Luca felt that yes, it was somehow his fault for having remained silent for so long, for having accepted the privileges without questioning the price Helena was paying. He asked if she had already told her father, and Helena shook her head. She explained that she was afraid, that Victor was always so busy and so happy with his new marriage, that she didn't want to spoil it for him. Luca suggested that perhaps they should tell him together, that together they would be stronger. Helena considered it for a moment, a spark of hope igniting in her eyes, but then she let it die, shaking her head sadly. She said she had already tried to drop hints, leave clues, but her father never noticed. And if she told him directly, Chiara would deny everything, and then things would get even worse. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Chiara had returned from shopping. Luca stood up quickly, feeling panic rising in his chest. If his mother found them talking, if she suspected they were forming an alliance, he didn't know what would happen. Helena noticed his fear and gestured that he could go. Luca left the room hurriedly, leaving Helena alone once more. That evening during dinner, Victor finally arrived home in time to eat with his family. He was in a good mood. His complex case had been resolved favorably and he wanted to celebrate. Chiara prepared a special dinner, a succulent roast with potatoes and roasted vegetables, a fresh salad, and for dessert, a pave that was Victor's favorite. The table was beautifully set, with candles and fine china. Victor sat at the head of the table smiling broadly, praising Chiara for her effort. She served generous portions for him and Luca, but when it was Helena's turn, she placed only a small slice of roast and some unseasoned vegetables on her plate. Luca watched, his stomach churning. He glanced at his father, hoping Victor would notice the disparity, hoping he would question why Helena had received so little. But Victor was busy recounting his day, his court victory, his satisfied clients. He ate enthusiastically, oblivious to his daughter's meager plate. Helena ate in silence, chewing each piece slowly, trying to make it last. When everyone had finished and Chiara began serving the pave, Helena watched her father and Luca receive generous portions. To her, Chiara simply said that the pave was finished, that perhaps she could make another one next week. It was a blatant lie. Luca could see there was enough pave in the dish. Helena could see it too. But nobody said anything. Victor, satisfied and relaxed, didn't notice the lie or chose not to see it, and Luca, caught between loyalty to his father and fear of his mother, remained silent, his spoonful of pave turning into a weight in his stomach. After dinner, when everyone moved into the living room, Victor announced that he had gifts. He had bought tickets to a show that Luca had mentioned wanting to see, and also a new tablet for the boy to use for his studies. Luca was ecstatic, hugging his father and thanking him profusely. Then Victor turned to Helena with a smile, and the girl felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps he had something for her too, some sign that she hadn't been forgotten. Victor reached into his pocket and took out a small box. He handed it to Helena, who opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a simple, pretty bracelet, but clearly less expensive and less thoughtfully designed than Luca's tablet. Helena thanked him softly, placing the bracelet on her wrist. She tried to smile, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. The disparity was glaring, the message clear. Luca was the priority. Helena was an afterthought. Chiara watched the scene with barely disguised satisfaction. She had planted subtle seeds in Victor's mind over the months, suggesting that Helena was becoming difficult, that perhaps she needed less attention to become more independent, that spoiling her wouldn't be good for her development. Victor, trusting his wife and too busy to investigate deeply, had absorbed these ideas without question. That night, Helena wrote in a diary she kept hidden under her mattress, along with a photo of her mother. "Sometimes I wonder if I still exist. I become invisible little by little, and no one seems to notice or care. Would anyone miss me if I disappeared completely?" The words were heartbreaking, but there was no one to read them, no one to see the silent cry for help from a child drowning in plain sight. Spring arrived, bringing flowers and a refreshing warmth. But for Helena, the seasons had lost their meaning. Each day was a repetition of the previous one, an endless succession of small humiliations and exclusions that accumulated like drops forming an ocean of pain. One morning, Helena woke up feeling particularly unwell. Her throat was sore, her head heavy, and her whole body ached. She stumbled down to breakfast, her face pale and her eyes feverish. Chiara was busy preparing Luca's special lunch for school, but she glanced quickly at Helena when the girl entered the kitchen. Helena tried to explain that she wasn't feeling well, that perhaps she needed to stay home. Chiara stopped what she was doing for just a moment, mechanically placed her hand on Helena's forehead, and declared that she didn't have a fever, that it was probably just tiredness. She firmly stated that Helena would go to school, that they couldn't let her stay home every time she felt a little unwell. Helena wanted to protest, but the words died in her throat. She grabbed her backpack and went to school, each step weighing like lead. During class, she could barely concentrate. Teacher Olivia's words seemed to come from far away, and the letters on the board blurred before her eyes. At recess, she finally collapsed, fainting under the tree where she usually sat. Olivia was called immediately. She ran to Helena, knelt beside the girl, and checked her vital signs. Helena's forehead was burning. The teacher carried the girl to the school infirmary, and the nurse confirmed that Helena had a high fever. They tried to contact the parents, first Victor, who didn't answer because he was in an important meeting, then Chiara. Chiara answered on the third ring, her tone impatient. When informed about Helena's situation, she sighed audibly as if deeply embarrassed. She said she was in the middle of a meeting with an important client, couldn't leave right now, and asked if the school couldn't simply let Helena rest there until the end of the day. Olivia, who was present during the call, felt something twist inside her. Chiara's reaction wasn't one of maternal concern, it was one of annoyance. The teacher insisted that Helena needed medical attention, that someone needed to pick her up. Chiara finally agreed, saying she would go, but her tone made it clear that she saw it as a great inconvenience. An hour later, Chiara arrived at school. She was perfectly dressed and made up, showing no sign of haste or worry. She spoke briefly with Olivia, assuring her that she would take Helena to the doctor, and then practically dragged the still weak girl to the car. All the way home, Chiara didn't utter a word of comfort. She drove in silence, her face a mask of restrained irritation. At home, instead of taking Helena to the doctor as she had promised, Chiara simply sent her to her room with a glass of water and 2 fever pills. She told Helena she should rest and stop making a fuss. Then she closed the door and went back to her activities, leaving the sick girl alone. Helena spent the next 3 days in her room, with a fever that came and went, her body aching and her throat burning. Chiara would occasionally come upstairs to leave a tray of watery soup and stale toast, but she never stayed, never really checked on Helena. Victor, in the rare moments he was home, was informed by Chiara that Helena only had a mild flu and was being well cared for. Luca, forbidden by his mother from visiting Helena for fear of catching the disease, listened to the muffled sounds of coughing coming from his sister's room. One night, when Chiara was sleeping and Victor was working late at the office, Luca disobeyed. He took a tray with fresh juice left over from dinner and some cookies he had saved, and went up to Helena's room. He knocked softly on the door and entered. Helena lay on the bed, pale as a ghost, covered by blankets that didn't seem enough to warm her. When she saw Luca, she tried to smile, but her expression came out more like a grimace of pain. Luca placed the tray on the bedside table and sat carefully on the edge of the bed. He asked how she was, and Helena, in a hoarse voice, said she was better, though clearly she wasn't. Luca offered her juice and cookies, and Helena gratefully accepted, her hands trembling as she held the glass. They remained silent for a few moments, Luca watching his sister take small sips, Helena trying not to cough too much so as not to worry him. Finally, Luca said something he'd been thinking for days. "It's not right, Helena. The way my mother treats you, it's not right, I know that now." Helena looked at him with tears in her eyes, not of sadness, but of relief. Someone finally saw. Someone finally understood. But before they could talk any further, they heard footsteps coming up the stairs. Luca stood up quickly, grabbed the dress, and hurried out of the room. It was Chiara coming to check something, and when she saw Luca in the hallway with the tray, her eyes narrowed dangerously. She didn't say anything at that moment, but Luca felt the weight of her gaze and knew there would be consequences. When Helena finally recovered enough to return to school, she was even thinner, even paler. Olivia watched her with growing concern. The teacher decided she needed to act. She arranged a private meeting with Victor, without informing Chiara, using as a pretext a discussion about Helena's academic performance. Victor arrived. At the meeting, straight from the office, still wearing his suit and tie, his mind clearly occupied with other matters. Olivia greeted him in her office, offered him coffee, and then carefully began to address his concerns. She spoke about how she had noticed changes in Helena, how the girl seemed increasingly withdrawn, how her weight had decreased, how her clothes were constantly worn out. Victor listened with growing attention, his expression shifting from confusion to concern. He admitted he'd been very busy lately, that perhaps he hadn't been paying enough attention. Olivia, choosing her words carefully, suggested that perhaps there were dynamics at home he wasn't seeing, that sometimes children hid difficulties to protect their parents. Victor was lost in thought. He had promised Olivia that he would pay more attention, that he would talk to Helena, that he would make sure everything was all right. But as he drove home, his mind was already returning to office problems, pending cases, tight deadlines. The promise, though sincere at the moment, was beginning to crumble under the pressures of daily life. At home that night, Victor tried. He called Helena into his office after dinner, closed the door for privacy, and sat beside her on the sofa instead of behind the desk. He asked how she was, not just physically but emotionally. He asked about school, about friends, about how she felt in her new family. Helena had a moment of decision. Part of her wanted to pour everything out, to tell him about the constant hunger, about Chiara's coldness, about feeling invisible in her own home. But when she looked into her father's tired eyes, at the lines of worry on his forehead, at the signs of exhaustion in every aspect of his appearance, the words wouldn't come. She thought about how happy he seemed with Chiara, how he had finally stopped wandering around the house like a ghost after Agnes's death. She thought about how telling the truth could destroy that happiness, could make everything crumble. And then, with a strength she didn't know she possessed, Helena lied. She said everything was fine, that maybe she was just a little tired, that the teacher was worried unnecessarily. Victor seemed relieved by the response. He hugged Helena, told her he loved her, and that if she needed anything, she only had to ask. Helena snuggled into the embrace, absorbing that rare moment of paternal attention, knowing it would have to last because moments like this were becoming increasingly rare. But Helena's lie came at a price. By not telling her father the truth, she had perhaps lost her best chance for change. And Chiara, who had overheard part of the conversation through the half-open door, felt validated. If Helena wasn't complaining, then Chiara could continue with her methods without fear of consequences. The following weeks saw an intensification of the unspoken rules. Chiara began to implement a new system. Helena could only eat after everyone else had finished. During breakfast, she had to wait for Victor to leave for work and Luca to finish before she could help herself to any leftovers. At dinner, she had to help clear the table, and only then could she eat what remained on the serving plates. Helena accepted these rules without protest, moving through the house like a ghost, always present but never truly seen. She became an expert at being invisible, at occupying as little space as possible, at not disturbing, at not existing noisily. There was one particular day that marked a turning point in Helena's soul. It was a rainy Saturday, and Chiara decided to make a special lunch to celebrate a new commission she had won on her architecture project. She prepared an elaborate paella with fresh seafood, imported saffron, and all the traditional accompaniments. The house smelled wonderful, and Helena, who had helped clean and prepare the kitchen all morning, felt her stomach rumble with anticipation. When lunch was ready, the table was set with the fine china. Victor, Chiara, and Luca sat down and began to serve themselves. Helena waited her turn, but when she reached for the serving tongs, Chiara gently but firmly pushed her hand back. She said that Helena had eaten crackers earlier, so she shouldn't be that hungry, and that she should wait to see if there was anything left. Helena pulled her hand back, as if it had been burned. She looked at her father, hoping he would intervene, that he would say it was absurd that his daughter couldn't eat with the family. But Victor was engrossed in a conversation with Luca about football. He hadn't even noticed the exchange. And Luca, who had seen it, lowered his eyes to his plate, embarrassed but silent. Helena got up from the table and went upstairs to her room. She didn't cry, she was beyond tears. She simply lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling, feeling something inside her break definitively. Later, when everyone had finished and Chiara called her to eat what was left, Helena went downstairs and found only a spoonful of cold rice and a few pieces of bell pepper. There wasn't even any seafood, the most special part of the dish. She ate it standing up in the empty kitchen, listening to her family's laughter coming from the living room where they were watching a movie together. And at that moment Helena made a decision. She would stop waiting for salvation. She would stop believing that things would magically get better. She needed to find a way to survive on her own, to protect what remained of her soul, before Chiara managed to completely erase her existence. That night, Helena wrote a letter, not to give to anyone, but to herself, a record of her pain, proof that what was happening was real and not her imagination. She wrote about the hunger, the coldness, the invisibility, the love she sought and never found. She hid the letter along with her mother's photo and her diary, her secret survival file. And as the house sank into the silence of the night, Helena made a promise to her mother's memory. She would survive. She didn't know how. She didn't know for how long. But she would find a way to go on until one day somehow things changed. They had to change. Because the alternative was simply to disappear. And despite everything, despite the pain and loneliness, Helena still wanted to exist, still wanted to be seen, still wanted to be loved. Summer arrived, bringing long, hot days. School was on break, and for Helena this meant spending even more time at home, even more exposed to the cruel dynamic that had been established. There was no more daily school break, no more Olivia watching with worried eyes, no more recess where she could at least sit alone in peace. Chiara used the summer to intensify Luca's activities. He had summer camps, tennis lessons, weekend getaways. Each activity was an opportunity for Chiara to show her maternal devotion, taking him, picking him up, participating in events with other parents. Helena, of course, was not included in any of these activities. When Victor asked why Helena didn't participate, Chiara always had a ready excuse. It was too expensive to do both. Helena had expressed that she wasn't interested, or the activity was already full. During the hot days, when Luca was at his activities, Helena stayed home alone with Chiara. These were the most difficult times, when Chiara's public persona could completely slip. She assigned Helena tasks that were far beyond what was appropriate for a child her age, cleaning all the bathrooms, organizing the linen closet, washing the windows, taking care of the entire garden. Helena performed these tasks under the scorching sun, her hands becoming rough, her skin burning, her small body exhausted from the effort. Chiara watched from the comfortable shade of the balcony, always finding something that wasn't perfect, always demanding that Helena redo some part. There was no reward for this work, no recognition. Chiara treated it as if it were Helena's natural obligation to contribute in this way, while Luca was exempt from any domestic responsibility. He would return from his activities and find the house spotless, without any idea of the work Helena had done to keep it that way. On a particularly hot afternoon, Helena was in the garden pulling weeds when she felt her vision darken. She hadn't had a proper breakfast, just some leftover toast, and she hadn't had lunch because Chiara said she needed to finish the garden before eating. The sun was at its highest point, with no clouds to offer relief. Helena tried to stand, but her legs gave way, and she fell to her knees on the dry grass. Chiara watched from the window, but didn't move to help. She simply observed with a neutral expression, as Helena struggled to regain her composure. It took long minutes before the girl managed to stand again, unsteady but determined to finish the task so she could finally eat something. When Helena finally entered the house, covered in sweat and dirt, she found a plate left on the kitchen counter. There was a piece of dry bread and a glass of lukewarm water. That was it. Her lunch after hours working in the scorching heat. Helena ate everything without complaint, each bite a mixture of physical necessity and emotional defeat. The neighbors, Marco and Fiona, remained worried. They had seen Helena working in the garden in conditions that didn't seem appropriate. Fiona commented to Marco that the girl looked so thin, so tired, so sad. Marco agreed, but both felt trapped by the uncertainty of what to do. Interfering in other people's family matters was delicate, especially without concrete proof of anything wrong. One day, Fiona decided to do something small but meaningful. She baked a plate of homemade cookies and crossed the garden to the neighbor's house. When Chiara answered the door, Fiona cheerfully explained that she had baked too many and wanted to share. Chiara accepted with a polite smile, thanked her politely, but didn't invite Fiona inside. Through the half-open door, Fiona could see Helena in the background, sitting on the living room floor folding clothes. The girl was so focused on her task that she didn't even look up when the door opened. Fiona tried to get her attention, to wave, but Chiara quickly moved to block her view and closed the door firmly, still smiling but with cold eyes. That night, Fiona told Marco about what she had seen, about the blank expression on Helena's face. about how the house seemed immaculate, but something profoundly wrong was happening within those walls. Marco suggested that perhaps they should speak to Victor directly, but Fiona pointed out that they never saw him, that he left early and returned late, always in a hurry, always busy. Inside the house, Helena continued her invisible existence. She had developed survival strategies. She kept small pieces of food in her room whenever she could, hidden in a box at the back of the closet. They were just stale biscuits or fruit that was about to spoil, but they were hers, a small reserve for the days when hunger became unbearable. She had also learned to steal small moments of peace. When everyone was asleep, she would quietly go down to the kitchen and drink water, filling a bottle that she would take to her room. Sometimes, if there were leftovers in the refrigerator that no one seemed to notice were missing, she would take some, eat quickly, standing in the dark kitchen, always alert for any sound of footsteps. They were small acts of silent rebellion, ways of maintaining some control over her own survival. But they came with the constant weight of the fear of being discovered, of imagining what Chiara would do if she caught her. Luca had also developed his own strategies, albeit different ones. He began saving food from his meals to secretly pass to Helena. During dinner, when no one was looking, he would slip a piece of bread or meat into his pocket. Later, when he went to his room, he would pass by Helena's room and discreetly leave the food on her desk. Helena discovered the first piece of chicken wrapped in a napkin one night and was initially confused. But when it happened again, and she noticed the pattern, she understood that it was Luca trying to help in his own way. It was a small but significant gesture, a bridge of solidarity between two siblings caught in an impossible situation. Victor remained oblivious to all of this. His work had become more demanding than ever. He was being considered for senior partner at the firm, a promotion that would mean more responsibilities, more money, more prestige. To achieve this, he worked tirelessly, often staying at the office late into the night, skipping family dinners, bringing work home on weekends. Chiara encouraged this, of course. She praised Victor's dedication, said she was proud of him, that she understood the demands of his career. She created for him a seemingly perfect home where he could relax in the rare moments he was present. The house was always clean and organized, the meals were delicious, Luca was clearly happy and well cared for. Victor had no reason to question, to look deeper, to see what was hidden in the shadows of his own home. There was a moment, a single moment, when the truth almost came to light in a different way. It was a Sunday afternoon, one of the rare occasions when Victor was home and awake. He decided to spend time with the children, perhaps watch a movie together. He called Luca and Helena into the living room, made popcorn, and chose an animated film that he thought they would both enjoy. Luca sat on the sofa next to his father, animated and comfortable. Helena hesitated at the door, unaccustomed to being included in these moments. Victor gestured for her to sit, indicating the space on the other side of him. Helena sat cautiously, keeping a small distance, as if she weren't sure if the invitation was real. During the movie, Victor, without much thought, put his arm around Helena and pulled her closer. It was a natural, paternal gesture, something he often did with Luca. But when his arm wrapped around Helena's thin shoulders, he felt something that made him pause. She was so thin, so bony. He could feel her ribs through her thin t-shirt. Victor looked down, truly looking at his daughter for the first time in months. Her arms were too thin. Her face was gaunt. There were dark circles under her eyes. How hadn't he noticed? When had she become so thin? A wave of worry and guilt washed over him, and he was about to ask if she was eating properly when Chiara entered the room. She sat gracefully in the armchair and began chatting with Victor about plans for the coming week. Victor's preoccupation was momentarily distracted, and by the time he turned his attention back to Helena, ready to ask the question, she had gotten up with the excuse of going to the bathroom. When she returned, the moment had passed, and soon Victor's phone rang with an office emergency. He had to leave, promising to finish the film with them at another time, a promise that, like so many others, would be forgotten amidst the constant demands of his career. But that moment of awareness, that glimpse of something wrong, remained buried in his mind, a seed that would eventually germinate. That night, Helena wrote in her diary, For a moment today, I thought Dad was going to see. I thought he was finally going to realize. But then the moment passed, as it always does. I wonder how many moments need to pass before it's too late. The words were prophetic, because things were about to reach a critical point in ways no one could have predicted. Summer was drawing to a close, and with it would come a series of events that would finally force everyone to confront the truth that had been so carefully hidden. Fiona and Marco, after much deliberation, decided they needed to do something more direct. They couldn't simply continue observing while something was clearly wrong. Marco suggested they try speaking to Victor in person, catching him before he entered or left the house, and having a frank conversation about their concerns. The opportunity came one Saturday morning. Victor was leaving early for a meeting at the office, and Marco intercepted him on his way to his car. He began cautiously commenting on the weather, on the neighborhood, building rapport before broaching the delicate subject. Finally, Marco mentioned that he and Fiona had noticed that Helena seemed to be having difficulties, that she always seemed so alone, so sad. He chose his words carefully, not wanting to accuse but wanting to express genuine concern. Victor immediately became defensive. He appreciated the concern, but assured them that everything was fine at home, that Helena was simply going through an adjustment period that was taking longer than expected. Marco tried to gently insist, mentioning specific things they had noticed, but Victor was running late, stressed, and didn't want to hear implicit criticism about his family from a well-meaning but meddling neighbor. He cut the conversation short, politely but firmly, got into his car, and drove off. Marco stood on the sidewalk, feeling he had failed, but at least he had tried. He went home and told Fiona, who sighed deeply, both wondering what else they could do. Inside the house, Chiara had observed Marco and Victor's conversation from the window. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could tell from their body language, from Marco's expression, that he was talking about something serious. She could guess what it was about. A cold feeling of anger settled in her chest. The neighbors were meddling, asking questions, potentially planting doubts in Victor's mind. This was unacceptable. She would need to be more careful, more discreet, but she would also need to ensure that Helena had no opportunity to confirm any suspicions others might have. That afternoon, while Victor was still at the office and Luca was at a birthday party, Chiara called Helena into the kitchen. She sat at the table and instructed Helena to do the same. When Helena obeyed, Chiara began to speak in a low but menacing tone that made Helena's blood run cold. She said she had noticed Helena doing things to get attention, trying to make others think she was being mistreated. She warned that any attempt by Helena to tell stories to her father, teachers, or neighbors would not end well. She didn't specify what that meant, but the implied threat was clear in the air between them. Helena said nothing, only nodded, her eyes fixed on the table, her whole body tense. Chiara stood up, satisfied, and left the kitchen, leaving Helena alone with the weight of those words. The girl went up to her room, locked the door, and for the first time allowed herself to question whether surviving was enough, whether there was any point in continuing to fight when each day brought only more pain, more isolation, more despair. But fate had other plans. That same day, Victor received an unexpected phone call from the office. The meeting that would have kept him out late had been cancelled. He decided to go home early, something that rarely happened, entering silently through the front door, wanting to surprise the family. Victor heard voices coming from the kitchen. He froze upon recognizing Chiara's menacing tone, so different from the sweet voice she used in his presence. Hidden in the hallway, he had heard every venomous word directed at Helena, every veiled threat, every cruelty that had remained hidden for so long. Victor's blood ran cold. The pieces began to fall into place with devastating clarity. Helena's thinness, her silence, the fear in her eyes, Marco's worries. How had he been so blind? When Chiara left the kitchen and found Victor standing there, his gaze was that of someone who had finally woken up. There were no screams, only a determined coldness in his voice as he told her she had an hour to pack her bags. Luca would stay with her, but Helena would never again be subjected to that treatment. That night, after Chiara and Luca left, Victor went into Helena's room. The girl was huddled in bed, her eyes wide with fear. He knelt beside her, tears streaming down his face, and begged forgiveness. Forgiveness for not seeing, for not protecting, for letting his loneliness blind him to his daughter's suffering. Helena started crying too, and father and daughter hugged as they hadn't in years. Victor promised he would never leave her side again, that she was and always would be his priority. In the following months, with the help of therapy for both of them, the girl slowly began to blossom again. A year later, Helena was truly smiling, her laughter echoing through the house that had become a home again. Victor learned that true love doesn't demand perfection, but presence. And together, father and daughter rebuilt their family, small but true and full of unconditional love. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope that Helena and Victor's story has touched your hearts and sparked important reflections on the importance of being present in the lives of those we love. This narrative reminds us that the greatest gift we can give someone is our genuine attention and unconditional love. If this story resonated with you, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more moving stories that explore the complexity of human relationships and the capacity for overcoming challenges that exists in each of us. Like this video if you believe that every child deserves to be seen and loved, and share your reflections on this story in the comments, or tell us if you have witnessed similar situations. Your stories and experiences enrich our community and can help others who are going through difficult times. Every day we bring you stories that celebrate the strength of the human spirit and the importance of true family bonds. Don't miss our upcoming content. Join this journey of stories that transform and inspire. Until the next story.